Windows Genesis sequence.
All right, here we go. Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you all for joining DevOps this year. Today we're going to talk about a Maven plugin which can really help you to boost your project creation. Before I'm going to tell you something about this though, let me first start with a little bit of an energizer. Enjoy your lunch. I'm not going to ask you to stand up and do like a dance-off or something, but I do want to do a quick raise of hands. And let me give you some context. So you come into work after DevOps, and you are asked to create a new application or a new service. This could be a microservice. This could be adding a new module to an existing application. Maybe you're creating the next AWS Lambda or Azure function. Could be anything. And the first thing you do is you open up your laptop, and there's a couple of things you can do, really. The first time that came to my mind is you create a .pom file or pom.xml file. You start from scratch. You pull in everything as you go, and you just start typing. So, quick raise of hands. Who does that? Starts from scratch by creating a POM file. Nice. I see a couple of hands. I like my keyboard warriors. That's awesome. Another thing you could do is use a tool such as Spring Initializer, or Quarkus has one, or Micronaut has one. There's a bunch of them out there. For those who don't know, it's a web application which you can configure with a default configuration, and you pull in some dependencies that you might need. Who uses tools like that? There's more hands. Awesome. This one is my favorite. I actually quite like this one. It's the famous copy, paste, and rename method. There we go. Here comes the hands. So you copy an existing application that somewhat does what you want. You paste it somewhere, and you cross your fingers that after renaming, everything goes well. Most of the time, or at least for me, that doesn't work. I forget to rename stuff. I have to fill the build pipeline like 4, 5, 6 times. It's just very, very annoying. The final one, who hasn't raised their hands yet but still wants to do so? All right, I think we have had everyone. That's good. Creating yet another service. It's fun in the beginning, but you quickly realize that you run into standard configuration that you really need because your company requires it, or you have certain ADRs, or you have certain ways of working within your company, which makes it kind of tedious. It's error-prone work, like I said. You might forget something, you have to wait for a build pipeline, and it fails. It is customized in a way, but within your context, it's pretty standard. And often, the process of creating one is not standard or not standardized. And this is where the Maven ArchType plugin can really help you. Before I dive into that, though, let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Giovanni van der Schelde. I'm a developer, trainer, and speaker at InfoSupport, which is a Dutch IT consultant company. I like to share my knowledge, and I like to contribute to open source, and particularly to Maven. So, what is the ArchType plugin? Well, it generates code. All right. And here comes the, well, mind-blowing part. In 2024, without the use of AI. I mean, we can do this. It's awesome. Jokes aside, though, it's a flexible and customizable way by creating templates, which we call archetypes, which we'll dive in a little bit later. It has been around for a while, which can be a good but also a bad thing. It's not as new as shiny, but it really does its job well for my use cases at least, and I hope for you too. And since Maven 4 beta has been released, it has seen some new activity, and I hope we continue to do so. So let me quickly do a demo. You may have already used Maven ArchType because they have been around for a while. Can everybody read this, or should I zoom in a little bit for the people in the back? I see some thumbs. Awesome. And the first thing we could do is we can use Maven. I'm using Maven 3, I believe. Yep. We can use Maven. We can invoke the ArchType plugin and the generate plugin goal. And when we do that, we get this very annoying list. You shouldn't look at it. I'm just going to press enter. It's going to select the default value for me, which is the standard Bootstrap application from ArchTypes. I want to use the latest version. That's fine. I am going to add a group ID, an artifact ID. Let's say Maven Marvels. Version is fine. Packaging is fine. And I like this configuration. And what we end up with is let's see. I put it in the wrong folder. Oops. Is a basic Maven application with a POM file and a hello world. Well, not as fancy, of course, but we can also just test this by running it, and we can actually see that we have a running app or a compilable app. Cool. But what just happened, right? Well, we invoked the Maven ArchType plugin with the generate goal. It looked up in a catalog, which can be either in your local repository or in a remote repository, which archetypes to use. So the big list you saw in the beginning is the one from the remote Maven Central. And there are some which are local, but you couldn't just see them because it's too big. It then actually fetches the selected archetype from the repository, which can, again, be local or remote. And it's going to ask you for the user input. Finally, after you've done everything, it generates a project, and that's a very basic overview of what it happens. And I have said ArchType quite often right now, but what does it really mean? Well, there's a couple of things, right? If you look at the documentation, there's actually two definitions, but I prefer the one from Wikipedia. And it says it's a prototype or a first form, like a main model that other statements, patterns, or behavior, or objects copy, emulate, or merge into. So we are defining a blueprint or template, which we can actually customize to our needs. So it's a very flexible way of defining your templates. It's also just another jar in your repository. It's not something new. It's something we already know. It's there, and nothing too fancy. And like I said, it can be either remote or locally in your repositories. So, catalogs. We already seen a couple. But if we run Maven ArchType generate, and we define an ArchType catalog, there's three options we have. First, we have the remote. This one is very big. I don't recommend this one because you cannot really search it. Once you look at documentation, you might find one you could use, but this needs some work. The more interesting ones, I find, is the internal one, which are the archetypes that come bundled by default with the plugin. As you can see, we have the Maven ArchType archetype. You can have a Maven ArchType plugin. There's a bunch of easy ways to start your projects. And the final one is the local one, which are the ones you have installed in your local repository. I've already created one a while back, and we'll see one appear after some more demos. Oh, yeah, and what's in the jar, of course? Well, it's not a jar of dirt. There's no cookies either. But let's open up one and see what happens. So I'm going to use the default quick starter one, and I'm going to unpack it. I've created some scripts, but it's going to echo what it's about to do. So I'm going to run jar xf on the ArchType quick starter jar. When we do that, we can see, let me just close this one out, that we get the meta-inf, which has some documentation, not too interesting for us right now. We can also see that we have a ArchType metadata XML, which is the descriptor of the archetype, which basically says, well, whenever you invoke this archetype, please use this configuration. It contains your properties, which we'll define later. It also has the file sets you're going to use, so which files to include. And, well, you might wonder, which files? Well, we have defined them in the archetype resources. It contains the source main Java, and finally, the app that we saw when we generated our project. There's some test files, and there's a standard POM as well. So how is this archetype set up? What is an archetype really made of, right? So first of all, it's just another Maven project. We have a pom.xml. We define the packaging type. We define what we need in our build. And for the packaging type, we need to use a different one. It's the packaging type Maven ArchType. And in order to build this packaging type, we need to extend our build with the ArchType packaging extension. We then have the source main resources folder, which we saw, and that contains the ArchType resources, which are the files we are going to copy to the new project, and the metadata in the meta-inf Maven folder in order to describe the configuration we really need to make our archetypes. So let me quickly show you what I mean by that. Well, this is the POM of the archetype. You can see the packaging type and the extension here. We have the archetype descriptor, which contains a lot of configuration here. So we can start with, for example, the required properties. It's good to note that you have a couple that are required by default, which are the group ID, the artifact ID, and the version. We were also asked to input this in the starter application, but we can define our own ones. So we can have a required properties element. It has a required property called service name. If you want, you can add a default value to it, so you don't have to input it yourself. You can override it later with command line properties or files. And you can add a validation regex in order to, let's say, make it start with like a capital letter if you really want to. We have file sets. And for a file set, we can say that we want to configure it in a certain way. We have to say that which directory we want to include. And we're going to say, optionally, if you want to include or exclude certain files. In this case, though, I am going to show you what I have here. I have a very simple application. I have some dummy data in here. I have a Docker file and a pipeline and whatnot. And I'm going to say, well, I want this directory, the source main Java, to be of encoding UTF-8. I also want it to be filtered. And when you filter, or when you say you want to filter a file set, you're telling the templating engine in the ArchType plugin that you want to filter the properties. So when we define a service name, when we look into, I think it's the README, or let's say group ID, for example, or package, it will look for the properties in our files, in this case package. Let's see if I have a different example. The POM, of course. Group ID, artifact ID, version, the required ones. It will look those up and filter them out and replace them with the actual values we provided. If we say filtered false, well, we don't filter them out, and you'll just end up with a property there if you happen to have a property but didn't filter it. We can also say we want to package our file sets. And as you may have noticed, we have a source main Java, but we don't have the packaging type, for example, com.example or com.myOrganization. When we say we want to package the file set, it provides us this directory structure. So if we were to generate this archetype, you can see that we get a Java com organization app folder structure. Same for package files. If you don't want it to be packaged, it won't generate those folders for you. And there's a bug currently, which we are about to release. With the directory, you have to provide this currently. If you don't, you'll get a NULL folder, which you don't really want, and an example to exclude. You can also include modules, but that's outside of this scope. There are some alternatives if you want to create archetypes. The ArchType plugin has a create from project goal, which basically says, well, I have this existing application, create an archetype for me based on this project. And keep in mind that it will actually just copy everything. So you probably are going to manually require to filter out certain files and certain properties, because it doesn't really automatically find those for you. Another option, as we saw earlier, is the Maven ArchType. It's pretty meta, but it generates an archetype for you in order to start creating archetypes yourself. I found that it's, well, not outdated anymore because the recent release did update it, but it didn't really add too much value to me because it's very bare bones and I might as well just create it myself if I'm already doing it anyway. We've already seen the packaging part. So yeah, it's based on the group ID to provide you the packaging structure. That's good to note as well. another thing we can do is create partial archetypes. So I said in the beginning of this talk, we can actually add a module to an existing application. So let's say we have a monolith or an application and we want to include a message receiver or want to include a repository in order to connect to our database. We can actually use partial archetypes for this. So let me just show you what you need to do for that. In our partial archetypes, we have one archetype. And all you need to do is add the partial true configuration here. I did notice that you have to explicitly include the files, so removing this actually broke it for me. I think that's still a bug, but I'd have to look into that more deeply. You do have to include the files you want in your archetype explicitly, but that's basically it. Everything else is the same, and there's no extra configuration beside the partial key attribute here. I have also got the resources, just as the other implementations. Nothing too fancy. I've added a module directory, a repository directory, which are just very basic Java classes. Again, I'm adding the properties myself to make it compile. And I have an existing application, which is nothing more than the starter project. And when we do this, if we go to the demo, I'm first going to install my archetype in order to find it locally. I'm going to invoke the archetype generate goal. I've added some values in order to not have to type it in too much. I also went into the directory of the existing application in order to kick off the generation process in the correct location. And when I start to use my new archetype, as you can see here, which is number 2, version is fine. I forgot to include that in the command line. And when we look at the existing application, we can actually see that it included the repo, model, and repository. So as you can see, there's no need to actually create new applications, but you can also add existing ones. It's also good to know that when you have dependencies there, so for example, I need Hibernate now for the repository, it merges the dependencies or your POMs into the application. So that's also solved for you. Oh yeah, that's good to note. There's a disclaimer though. It's not compatible with Maven 4 yet. We still have to fix that. It's trying to use a method which is not available in the current model, so it will crash your build. And like I said, you have to explicitly include the files in order to make use of the partial archetypes. And we've seen the interpolation, right? So whenever we define the properties, we see that they are replaced in our project. And we use a templating engine for that. It's called the Velocity Templating Engine. And well, what it kind of does is just find and replace, right? It can do much more than that, which I'll show you, but it just matches the property, finds it in your directory, and then will replace them. You can also use just a $sign with the property name, but I prefer to use the accolades as well to make it a bit more explicit. And at some point, I worked on this application, and we had to adhere to some conventions. So we have an application which has both migrations from code, and it has to connect to a database when the application is running. But we wanted to have different kind of permissions for those users, right? So when you're running a migration, it doesn't need all the database access. It just needs to run the migrations for you. But we had conventions on those names, and I didn't want the users to type in the property twice, but just slightly different. And I was like, yeah, well, maybe we can do this smarter. And the Velocity Templating Engine has its own kind of language, which is called the Velocity language, I guess. But you can actually define pretty complex functions with it. So, for example, if I go to this project, demo 7, you'll see that I have defined a database username. I've provided a default value as well, service db user. But let's say our migration user is going to be called service name underscore migration underscore user. It would be kind of silly if we ask the user, hey, type in the database username and also type in the migration username. Like, why can you not fix it for me? Well, we actually can. So if we look into the main resources, database properties, I've called it, we can use this templating language, right? So we use the syntax. It's a comment, and then we have set, which tells the engine to create a variable called split in this case. We're going to use our property from the required properties, and we want to split it based on underscore. So we'll get an array with service name, db, and user. We're then going to get the last index because we're only interested in the user part. And we can say, well, for the migration username, we want to get the first element, we'll append migration, and the final element. And when we run this, 7, I'm going to first install the ArchType again. I have to do a clean install in order to override my build, or the artifact. I'm going to add some default values again. This time I didn't forget the version. Use the latest version. I have to provide an app name. Let's say awesome. And you can see the default value being provided here. And it's like, oh, you're sure you want to use this configuration? And you're like, awesome, let's go. When we go into demo 7, which is the application I just generated, you'll see that we now have the service migration user property. Another good thing to note is that you can do the same thing for file names, but it does use a different kind of syntax. So if I go to my ArchType again, you noticed that I had to provide an app name, which I did. And I wanted my app name to start with the service name. And in order to do this with Velocity, the Velocity templating engine, you have to place 2 underscores, then the property name, and then 2 underscores again in order to replace the file names. I also had to, of course, use the app name in my class file in order to make it compile. And if we go to the actually generated project, you can see that we have an awesome app with the awesome app type. So that's pretty cool if you ask me. And it's very versatile in order to really customize your application. Maybe you have conventions based on names and whatnot. So it could be very interesting if you do deploy new applications pretty often. Yeah. There's a bunch more you can do with this templating engine. I'm not going to bother you with all the details because there's a guide for it. It's pretty complex. You can do crazy stuff with it. Once you get to this point of creating your own archetypes, definitely look up the guides, and you'll definitely have a good time. We did this. Awesome. Oh, right. There's a fun fact about the gitignore. It's pretty silly. So previously, the Maven Resources plugin used to ignore the gitignore because it's like a hidden folder, or it just wanted to exclude it from your files. And if you wanted to work around this, you actually had to rename the .gitignore file to __ some property name __, and then you had to add a required property with perhaps a default value with the .gitignore name, and it would actually replace the file name for you and include the gitignore. Fortunately, it is fixed. So we can use the useDefault excludes property in our POM of the archetype. So if you do that, it will actually copy the gitignore for you. So if we look in this POM file of the archetype, I did include the configuration here. And as you can see, I have a gitignore in my archetype. And when we look in the generated project, we actually have the gitignore. I also wouldn't recommend using version 3 because it's very old. And if you use the latest version, you're good to go. Another issue is that when you use the create from project goal, it doesn't currently work yet, so it will still exclude your git ignore. Another reason, in my opinion, not to use it, but there's a ticket for that if you feel like contributing to Maven and you feel like this is something I could pick up. Definitely look into it. I think it's one that could be very useful as well. So, right, we now kind of know what we can do with archetypes. We have seen how we can create it, how they work under the hood. And when you start using these in your company, I would like to highlight a couple of things that you might want to consider, which I definitely did. So, as it's just another Maven project, it's just another POM file, you can actually use lifecycle management on it. So if you have renovate, or if you have the GitHub bot, or anything like that, you can just put it on this project, on your archetypes, and it will keep it up to date for you, because there is nothing more important than when you use something that you might not use as frequently as, let's say, your normal code or your daily work. It would be annoying if it actually fails because you forgot to update some dependencies, or you run renovate and you're 17 versions behind. You're like, why? Just don't do this. Just use LCM in order to update your archetypes as well. It's just another Maven project. You also want to test your archetypes. I mean, testing is key, and tests allow you to validate whether or not it still works, right? So the ArchType plugin has the integration test goal, which allows you to build the archetype and then use the archetype you've just built to generate a project for you, and that all within the same Maven build. It's pretty interesting how it works, but it's actually a good way to test your archetypes. There's also an optional parameter you can use, or an optional way in order to validate the generated project to a reference project to compare those files and see if it's actually what you expect it to be. In order to make this work, though, there's a couple of things you need to do. So within your archetype, you're going to have to include a source test resources projects folder, which is the root of all your tests. And each subdirectory is going to be an integration test. Within this test directory, so let's say integration test 1, you're going to have to include an archetype properties file to define the properties that you require to have to generate it. You're going to need to include perhaps an empty goals.txt file, which are going to be the goals that you're going to run against the project that is generated afterwards. I recommend putting something in there always, for example, verify. And finally, it can contain a reference directory in order to compare your generated project to the reference project. So let's see that in action. If we go to demo 8, let me quickly show you the setup before we do that. It's way more interesting. I have the source main archetype folder, and I have a test folder now, which contains resources projects. In my first integration test, I have the archetype properties, and I have the goal.txt, in which I define verify. In the archetype properties, I define which archetype I want to be using. I'm going to define the required properties, and I'm going to also add my own property that I provided in my archetype. The second integration test is just the same, but I included a reference folder, which contains the entire project that I expect to be there. So if I were to check this out, I had to replace those values so it actually the entire application. I see that I made a typo here. Let me fix that for you. So I expect a user to be there, I expect an app to be there, and everything to be interpolated into my project. When we run the Maven Verify, I don't need to install my archetype this time because we're building it as we go. And we'll see that it's actually going to be running Maven inside of Maven. Let me check. Did I do it right? Because I expect there to be a test. Ah, there we go. Oh, we fixed it in the latest version. Cool. So as you can see, we ran the integration test phase, or goal, And it started with the integration test 2. You can inspect the parameters it used in order to create your project. And you can also see that it compared the generated project from my ArchType to the reference content. It does complain about some end of lines, but in the end, everything was equally as expected. I have also ran the integration test 1. I'm not entirely sure why it runs it in reverse order, but it does its thing. And it can actually generate the project for us and run the verify goal against it, so nothing broke. That's cool. But what if I change something, right? So what if I change the user to something like S-user? It shouldn't match anymore. And I expect my build to break. When I run Maven Verify again, we can see that we actually have an error in our build. And it tells us, well, I expect a S-user file to be there, but all I got was a user Java file. So that's a really good way to verify everything still works, and if there's very specific things you want to test, to actually compare it to one of those reference folders. Or projects, I should say. A good thing to note as well is that it's kind of silly. I've reported a bug, a ticket for it, is that properties with, or required properties with default values, you still have to include in your properties file, but I've added the default value, so I expect there to be a default value. I think it's something we could add in the future to make it a little bit easier for your tests. Things I've done in order to use it is I have created a, for the companies I did it, so I've had it in 2 places so far. They really enjoyed it. I've created one repository with a multi-module project, so you can do that with Maven, and each module is a different ArchType. So everything is in one place, and it makes it really easy to just find everything, to update everything, and make sure you can just quickly find your stuff. So I definitely recommend using that. Like I said, you really want things in place in order to validate your ArchTypes. So whenever you are going to use them, they are up to date, they are actually working, and you're sure you can generate projects the way you want them. Updating is something very important. Just keep everything up to date. You won't run into too many bugs. And like I said, there's nothing more annoying than using something and it breaks and you're like, I have to fix this now, because it should be making your developer experience just smoother. One easy thing to make it a little bit easier for adopting it within your company or within your project is you need to figure out a way to serve it to the developers, right? So one thing is you could actually deploy it to your repository manager. It's just a jar. It's just something they can actually find in the repositories. You can also just tell them to clone the repository in your version control system and install the ArchTypes locally. And that way they can just install it, use it local with the ArchType catalog parameter, and instantly make it work. And I find adoption a very important thing as well, right? So you don't want to be the only one that knows about this stuff. You don't want to be the bottleneck, and you want it to be used within the company by everyone. So what really works is to make a simple presentation and tell them hey, I've started using this, it's very useful, and if you want to use it, give me feedback and let them actually provide the fixes themselves so they can actually get a feeling of how it works. Because if you're the bottleneck, then you have to do everything yourself, and it's going to be very tiring, but also very inconvenient, right? And it kind of brings me to the pros and the cons of using ArchTypes. One thing that I really like is that it really saves precious time when you are going to start a new app, right? I don't want to be spending half a day to figure out how to make everything work because we didn't really document the way we need to create services. And I can just instantly work on the requirements I should be working on. We can also standardize stuff, right? So we really like to standardize our software and our ADRs and whatnot, but I found that we don't really look into standardizing project generation or projects creation. There might be a wiki, but it's most of the time not up to date, or someone forgot to update it. And making it reproducible, just like our builds, is something I really like about it. So you're just more quicker in providing the actual value to the company or to the project. If there's pros, there's also cons, of course. It's yet another tool you need to understand and maintain. So let's say if you're with a junior team or you only have one team, then you might want to consider not using it, right? Because it adds complexity. Something that would be really cool, but doesn't work yet, is you cannot apply an ArchType to an existing project that was generated from this ArchType. So let's say you have changing requirements, you have changing architectures. You might want to change your ArchType, but the projects generated from it, you still have to manually update. So it would be cool if you could apply them. But that's a con, it doesn't exist. This one I struggled with because there's no real good IDE support yet. It's a very small number of people that use it, so I guess the IntelliJ team, for example, didn't really focus on it yet. But it's pretty much open VS Code or text editor and start working with it, because otherwise you have a bunch of red lines and it really annoys me. A cool thing though, I spoke to Marit van Dijk from JetBrains, and you can actually use archetypes in IntelliJ. So if I go to IntelliJ, and I want to start a new project, you can actually go to generators, Maven archetypes, and you can start using them. You can define a catalog, so let's say the internal one. You can select a catalog you like, and it will provide you with a create option. The cool thing though is that you can use a local catalog as well. I think this is still a bug because you have to manually provide the path to your catalog. The default local doesn't work. But you can actually select your own archetypes that you have created and installed. You can select the versions, and if there is required properties, you can add them here, or they will show here. And if you want to add additional properties, you can add them here as well. So it's a pretty cool feature, which makes it just a bit easier to navigate those archetypes. And finally, like I said, it could use some community love. So if you're into this kind of stuff, you want to contribute to open source, definitely look at this plugin, for example. It has seen activity lately. We are updating it, but there's a bunch of stuff we can really bring into this. Or if you have any good ideas, please file a ticket, and we can start using it. So that brings me to the conclusion. Should you use archetypes or not? I'm not going to tell you whether you should or you shouldn't, but I just want to give you some questions to consider before bringing it into your project, so you're not running into work and like, we should be using this, but just think about it for a second. How often do you actually need to create new applications, right? Is it something you do once a year? Is it something you do every month? How often do you need this? Do you have the necessary automations in place, right? Do you have pipelines? Do you have Renovate or lifecycle management tools? Do you have the tests in place? And do you get the feedback you want when you are developing this? How often does your project change? How often do the requirements change? Is there a very standard way that never changes when creating one? Or is it a very greenfield project and you're still figuring out what you need to do? Because that means you also have to maintain the archetypes. Does the field team comfortable? Does the team feel comfortable developing or learning this new tool? Because they might be junior and they're still learning how to actually use Spring Boot, for example. And this just adds more cognitive load, and it's something to consider as well. And is there enough standardization to use archetypes, right? So it could be interesting if you're, for example, a very corporate organization, you have like 10 or 50 or 100 development teams. And for one team, it might not be very interesting to create archetypes, but if you zoom out a little bit, it could be pretty useful to give this very standard way of creating applications. And just make it faster for everyone to start developing. And that brings me to the final slide. Thank you all for listening. If you have feedback, please add it through the app. It helps the conference, it helps me. If you don't feel like it, don't do it, but it would be very, very cool. And thank you all for listening. If there's any questions, feel free to come or raise your hands, but thanks.
initialize Genesis sequence.